Our next speaker needs no introduction, but if I may, I'd like to say a few words about Dr. Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria is host of CNN's flagship international affairs program, Fareed Zakaria GPS. He's editor-at-large of Time, a Washington Post columnist, and a New York Times best-selling author. In 2010, Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. Since 2008, he has hosted Fareed Zakaria GPS, which airs Sundays worldwide on CNN. He serves on the boards of Yale University, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and Shakespeare and Company, a theater group in the Berkshires. He has received honorary degrees from Brown, the University of Miami, and Oberlin College, among many other educational institutions. Dr. Zakaria earned a bachelor's degree from Yale University and a doctorate in political science from Harvard University. He lives in New York City with his wife, son, and 2 daughters. Please help me introduce Dr. Zakaria. I'll be in the back.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. It's an extraordinarily important subject that you have chosen to talk about, and I am somewhat intimidated at the prospect of speaking to a group of people who are really more expert on this subject than I am. And so I will do what a good expert or journalist or academic does in situations like this. I will change the subject. What I really want to do is to begin by talking about the background conditions for the topic we're talking about before I get to it. That is to say, why are we in this world where cyber war and cyber threats have become as big a deal as they have today? I would argue that it all begins with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. See, before that, we lived in a world that was hermetically sealed. I grew up in India, and the India I grew up in had almost no contact with the Western world in any meaningful sense. Yes, there were magazines and newspapers and things like that, but to the extent that there was business done, it was trade. Stuff was made in India, it was shipped to the United States, and vice versa. That world was divided, if you will, into two not quite halves, 2 sections, the open world economy and the rest. The open world economy, most people don't completely realize, was very small. It was a handful of countries in the North Atlantic, Western Europe, United States, Canada, and about 5 countries in Asia: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. That was it. Everybody else in the 1960s, 1970s was engaged in import substitution, closed market policies, socialism, quasi-socialism, what was called a mixed economy in many places. And as a result, these 2 worlds didn't interact much. You had also a great deal of political conflict as a result of that war. There were 18 civil wars going on in the 1970s and 80s that were civil wars or interstate wars in which the Soviet Union was funding one side of the struggle and the United States was funding the other side of the struggle. And these are not small events. These are, in Indochina, 3 million people died in the 1970s. In the Iran-Iraq war, 1.5 million people died in the 1980s. In the Congo, 4 million people died in the 1990s. And then, as I say, comes 1989, and this world, all of a sudden, 1/2 of this world, or the pole that was supporting, directing, and providing lifeblood to 1/2 of this world just collapsed, the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, you were confronted with a very different world that, to begin with, was much more stable and at peace than it had ever been before. Now, you might think that this strikes you as an odd observation because you know that we live in very dangerous, scary, uncertain times. But from the point of view of political violence, that is to say, violence caused by politics, war, civil war, and yes, terrorism, the numbers are very clear. Actually, at this university, there is a think tank that does a tabulation of the number of people who have died as a result of political violence. And over the last 40 years, that line looks something like this. It's way down. And it's because all those wars I was talking about have wound down in some way or the other, largely because the Soviet Union, one of their principal sponsors, collapsed, and for other reasons as well. You have bad things going on in the world, but nowhere on the scale that they were going on in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and of course, if you go earlier than that, you get to World War II and World War I. So, Steven Pinker, professor at Harvard, has calculated that we are probably living in the least violent times in human existence. I'm not sure that that's quite true, but let's put it this way. We're living in an unusual period of political stability because you do not have military competition of an active kind, wars, proxy wars and such, among the major powers in the world. So that is, if you will, the pillar of political stability that began this world that we have entered into. The second would be a kind of economic convergence. As I said, this old world had very few people playing the game that the United States plays and playing in the single open market system. And then all of a sudden, Soviet Union collapses, communism collapses, and is discredited, and every country around the world is trying to figure out what do they do. And they realize they have no option but to join the open trading system that the United States and its Western European allies had set up after World War II. And you see this, I remember traveling from India to China to Brazil, all over the world, and everyone is trying to figure out, okay, how do we revamp our economies? And you recall this is a period when you have a slew of major reform programs across all these countries that all now are trying to play the new game as they understand it. And they all join the open global system. And this has all kinds of effects. One of them is that for American companies, you all of a sudden realize that the number of potential customers you have has just gone up a lot. I remember talking to Lou Gerstner, who was running who was running American Express at the time, later ran IBM. And Lou said, when I was at American Express, at some point in the early 1990s, we sat down and said to ourselves, let's just understand what has happened. Did the potential client base for American Express just double, triple, or quadruple? And they concluded after some study that it had tripled in the space of 2 or 3 years. Right? This is a very, very unusual moment where all of a sudden you see the whole world of the former Soviet space, Eastern Europe, parts of Central Asia, large swaths of India, and almost all of Latin America suddenly move into this single orbit. And you have a kind of economic convergence where they're all now playing the same game. They're all part of the open global system, and they're all part of the open world economy. And this is happening at a time when we are also solving one of the most vexing problems economically that has plagued countries. In the 1970s, every country in the world had one principal concern, which was inflation. Inflation was at its highest in the United States at the time. There was something called the misery index, which if you took inflation and unemployment and added them together, you'd get to about 25%. But everywhere in the world, countries were battling with very high inflation. And American inflation rates, while very high for America, were nothing like what was being experienced in some other countries. And big countries. Brazil had 200% inflation. Turkey had 200% inflation. Peru had 2,000% inflation. And everywhere this was causing deep social instability, and it was making it very difficult for businesses to plan and invest for the future. See, hyperinflation of this kind is much more destabilizing than a recession. A recession, even a slow recovery like the one we are in, affects your it affects your opportunity cost, that is your potential to make more money. You would have better jobs and better bonuses if there were more vigorous economic growth in this country. But hyperinflation doesn't rob you of what you might have had, it robs you of what you already have. it destroys your savings. It destroys the value of your assets. And as such, it destroys the middle class. So the world of the 1970s, middle classes everywhere were being ravaged. And they were, as a result, dropping support for the regimes under which they lived. And so you would see in Iran, in Latin America, regime after regime would face crises and often be replaced in a coup or a revolution. And the background condition in almost all these cases, from Iran to Brazil, was very high, persistent inflation. India, the country I grew up in, has had a 65-year experience of continuous democratic governance with a 2-year exception, 1975 to 1977, when there was a period of what was called emergency rule, which was basically martial law. What was the background condition? 1974-75 were the worst period of inflation for India in its independent history. And you see this, as I say, all over the world. Then, 1979, in comes Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he comes to Washington, the Federal Reserve, and decides he's going to kill inflation in America. And he jacks up interest rates and kills inflation in America. And in a copycat fashion, central banks around the world begin doing very similar things, and soon you get to a point where you have this almost complete victory over hyperinflation. The number of countries that had hyperinflation in the 1970s, in 1979, to pick one year, was about 34. Depends a little bit on how you calculate it, but it was about somewhere in the mid-30s. The number of countries that have hyperinflation today is 0. There used to be 1, but 6 months ago, Zimbabwe dollarized its economy, and so it no longer has hyperinflation. Now, the effect of this is extraordinary because the effect of conquering inflation means you have a period of low inflation, low interest rates, and low cost of capital, which allows businesses to think about the future, plan for the future, and invest in the future. This has happened on a scale unprecedented. We've never had inflationary expectations so low for so long. It's been basically a generation now. You've never had it so widespread that there is almost no place in the world where you've had to worry about it. So, political stability, economic stability. And the third piece of this is technological connectivity. That's the information revolution. Now, you know about this, but I just want to remind you how recent this phenomenon is. When people talked about globalization in the past, what they really meant was trade. In 1910, people say the world was highly globalized, and it was true. There was a lot of trade, but it was really just trade. It meant that people made stuff in England, and they shipped it to Germany, and then they made stuff in Germany and shipped it to England. Today, we mean something completely different. We mean complex global supply chains that are operated on a real-time basis in 10, 15, 20 countries. So you literally have a kind of global manufacturing, assembly, sales, and distribution process where it would be almost impossible to actually determine what country a product is made in. It actually makes nonsense of most of our GDP numbers. This is an area where economists have really not caught up with the reality of the world. You know, if you look at a GE jet engine, it's made in 14 countries and then sold in 10 others. The capital for it has been raised across the world. Whose GDP should it go under? Right? What country's GDP should it go under? Nobody really knows. And GDP is a 19th century national income accounting statistic, and we're using it very bluntly to shoehorn this data from the 21st century economy. But the world of the information revolution begins, of course, with computers and such, but what you notice a step function change take place during the technology boom and bust, and of course, the creation of this global connected world was largely a product of the technology boom. You remember during the technology boom, any company that had a .com in its name or any company that claimed to be a technology company was able to get lots of money from public markets. There was huge amount of equity available, and companies, the smart companies, used that equity as cash. And they used it to build out their networks. Take a company like Global Crossing. Global Crossing raised enormous amounts of money on the public equity markets and then laid fiber optic cable from end to end around the world. And now, in a very typical pattern, and this happened with railroads in the 19th century, you had a boom in this area, which meant there was a massive oversupply, which meant the cost collapsed. And what you saw happen was once you had fiber optic cable laid across the world, it became as cheap to make a phone call from New York to New Jersey as it was from New York to Mumbai or New York to Shanghai. The cost, if you will, of communication almost collapsed to zero. And at that point, of course, most of these companies went out of business because they had actually sowed the seeds of their own demise. But unlike in the railroad case, the nature of broadband technology was the deed was done. The world was wired, and now everybody was going to be able to use this infrastructure and piggyback off of it. And that was the beginning of this extraordinary shift. The second, if you will, the 1-2 punch in this process is the dot-com boom produces the infrastructure that wires the world. The dot-com bust and the subsequent economic recession meant companies in the Western world suddenly had to find ways to become very efficient. And so they began figuring out ways to source and locate their factories, their offices, their call centers in places in the world where labor was cheaper, and because of the connectivity, they were able to transmit data, information, goods, and services about as quickly and easily as they had. It begins with the invention of the big ships in the 16th century in Holland and Spain and the United Kingdom. And what that does is it begins the age of exploration, and it begins the age of cheap transport, cheap in those days compared to the overland routes. And then you get, so that begins the process of making goods cheaper and cheaper to transport. You then get the revolution in banking, which makes capital cheaper and cheaper to transport. And what the internet and this global connectivity does is it makes services essentially free to transport. And so you have finally achieved this extraordinary situation where you now have labor mobility in a global economy for the first time on an unprecedented scale. Not because people can go to wherever jobs are available in the world, but because jobs can go to wherever people are available in the world. And that is essentially what has happened with the creation of this global interconnected system. Jobs can go to where people are. I was talking to somebody who runs a large company, and he said, we no longer make decisions on with the nation state as our frame of reference. We have 12 different offices in the world. We employ people and we pay them roughly the same. And we try to determine what is the most effective place to cite somebody based on what is the nature of the job, who are the customers, where are they. He said, from that point of view, we are in a sense operating as a virtual global company. This is inconceivable before this happened. Now, to remind you, this is all very recent. You know, the dot-com boom and bust is 1999, 2000. In fact, you know, if you think about it, if I were to take away all the things that you absolutely rely on to do your jobs, I'm going to take away your BlackBerries, iPads, iPhones, laptops, take away the internet, the World Wide Web itself, every website you use. I've now taken you back to the dark ages of 1990, right? I mean, think about that. Somehow, businesses actually operated without all this stuff only 20 years ago. Somehow, business got done, this university existed, the world actually was still spinning. And what that points out is that this is very early stages still of this revolution that we're going through. And we still don't completely understand its full potential. We see it when we see these global supply chains. You know, I mean, a guy who was a senior executive at GE told me once, he said, you know, in the old days, now when he says old days, he means, again, the 1970s and 80s, not the 19th century. He said, when we used to do global manufacturing, what it meant was we'd send a guy to India or Brazil or someplace like that and say, make a bunch of machines and put them on a ship and send them to us, and drop us a postcard telling us when they're going to get to the port. That was basically how we did global manufacturing. He said, today the way you do global manufacturing is you have a floor manager at a Walmart who is managing the SKUs in that Walmart, and every time some customer takes one more item off the rack, he sends a message to a factory in Guangdong, which Walmart doesn't even own, and tells them, can you manufacture one more of these widgets and put it on the next shipment you have coming in? And by the way, they tell the trucking company, can you make sure that you arrive in parking space number A16 at 4:30 a.m. On December the 22nd, because that's when that parking slot will be available. So that is a continuous supply chain operating at a global scale. That's the difference between just 25 years ago and today. We don't really understand also how it will change human behavior. We see this a little bit more easily in the political realm than in the business realm, because it's more dramatic and it gets more televised. So I'll give you one example of this. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, as you know. Now, the country that is next door to Kuwait is Saudi Arabia. Saudi is very worried about what this means for them, because if Iraq is invading Kuwait for its oil, well, the mother lode of oil is in Saudi Arabia, and all the tanks needed to do was just keep driving for another hour, and they'd be in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi system is very conservative country, very conservative monarch. The monarch is 85 years old. The monarch in Saudi Arabia, by the way, is always 85. It's a very strange political system. It's a monarchy in which when the monarch dies, his next oldest brother becomes the king. And there are 66 of them waiting in turn. So by the time it's your turn, you will be 85. The current monarch is 87. His younger brother is 84. So this guy says, you know what? Let's not tell anyone that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I just need some time to think. So for 1 week, it was a Saudi state secret that their next-door neighbor had been invaded. And it held. Right? This is 1990. Ask yourself today, even in Saudi Arabia, how long could such a secret hold? I would say 30 seconds, right? Because even in Saudi Arabia, you have CNN, you have BBC, you have Al Jazeera, you have Al Arabiya, you have websites, you have, you just have a mobile phone, and that's enough, right? What is Twitter? Twitter basically says, answer the question in 140 characters or less, what are you doing right now? So all you need is some guy in Kuwait to say, I'm being invaded by Iraq, right? And that's the end of your Saudi state secret. But think about that. The power to control information has been one of the seminal powers of government for hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, governments don't have the power to control information. If you watch what happened in the Arab Spring, this is how I see what happened in the role of technology. If you went to Egypt only 10 years ago, you would have watched on Egyptian television the only thing you could watch, which was the Egyptian state television. And Egyptian state television primetime program was essentially the daily calendar of the dictator. It was basically Hosni Mubarak got up this morning, he had breakfast, he then went to this school and he opened it. He then went to a trade delegation and wished them well. He had lunch with the foreign minister of France. They discussed the Middle East peace process. He then went to an export fair, and that was it. Was the satellite revolution. Satellite revolution meant that you got BBC and CNN and then Al Jazeera. And that told Egyptians what was actually going on in the world. And all of a sudden they began to see how the rest of the world lived, what was actually going on in the world, and what other people were saying about their country. The second blow was the internet revolution. And you began to have you began to be able to publish anonymously without fear of retribution. A large number of the websites that were created in the Arab world had servers either in the West or in Dubai or Beirut or places that were relatively free. And those websites would present a kind of alternate picture of reality, so that many of the key websites that launched the Arab Spring were websites that were contesting the government's arguments about why they had arrested various people, whether those people had been tortured, what was the state of political prisoners in, say, Egypt. And those websites maintained on servers, in the Egyptian case, often in Dubai, were able to contest the narrative, the storyline that the regime was providing. And then the third blow was social networking, which allowed people to organize at very low costs. And that process was something you saw in the moments during the revolution, but was a kind of ongoing process taking place around the Arab world. In fact, the best place you could see it was in Iran during the Green Movement. Now you say, well, that movement didn't succeed. That's not the point. The point is that all of a sudden, the asymmetry of power asserted itself, which was that you were able to organize at very low cost. And it was actually a very high cost to disrupt you. So eventually what happens in Iran is the Iranian government decides that they're going to shut down the entire cellular phone system of the country because they don't want 400 people gathering in some park in Tehran. Now think of what that means in terms of shutting down the cellular phone system of a country. You're shutting down economic activity for several hours, sometimes days, because you don't want 400 people gathering in some square in Tehran. That's the power of the social network. And the particular power that social networking has, and the potential, I would argue, is even greater, because remember, in most of the world, a laptop is still a luxury. A cell phone is a necessity. And what social networking, companies or phenomena like Twitter have done, is effectively eliminate the distinction between the computer and the phone. There are only two questions that matter now. Do you have connectivity and can you transmit data? And if you can do those two things, the device you have is effectively a computer. And it can be used the way a computer can to network with all the other computers in the world. And that is an incredibly powerful, low-cost force multiplier. Whether you're an African farmer who is now cutting out the middleman and figuring out what the actual price of the wheat you're selling is and therefore are able to charge a higher price, or whether you're a political dissident in one of these countries. And remember, this is really the cell phone phenomenon is a truly mind-boggling phenomenon. I give you one statistic just to give you a feel for how strange it is at some level, and how ubiquitous it has become. There are, in India, by most people's counts, about 140 million toilets. There are 550 million cell phones. So there are 3 times as many cell phones as toilets in India, something, for those of you who have visited, you can readily see and smell. But it's an extraordinary fact about poor countries that having a cell phone has become a necessity for a peasant, for somebody who works at a truck shop. And now what's happening is these phones are becoming computers, and they are becoming kind of permanently connected to a network. So if you think about what all this means going forward, it's a new world, and it's an extraordinary world that none of us have a really good feel for what it's going to look like. And it is in that context that we are talking about the issues we are talking about today. I began to notice the phenomenon that we're discussing, and I'm looking at it first from a somewhat national security point of view, during the Gulf War. During the Gulf War, one of the things I noticed was that the Chinese government was paying obsessive attention to American military tactics and strategy in the Gulf War. Why was this? Because they were noticing that the United States had by then, the Gulf War was the first time we were able to marry satellite technology, information technology, and munitions technology in a way that created a kind of step function change in warfare. You remember, for those of you who who watched it, you were able to see on television the bullseyes placed on windows within bunkers in Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard, and the bomb would be delivered via satellite into those bunkers. And that blew the minds of the Chinese, and they just thought to themselves, okay, we are not going to make the same mistake that the Soviet Union made. We are not going to try to symmetrically match the United States tank for tank, weapon for weapon. And that is still basically the approach they're taking. Look, China is the second largest economy in the world, right? We have 15 carrier groups. How many does China have? 0. They're in the process of building their first one. So they've been increasing defense spending by double digits every year since then. What are they investing in? They are investing in asymmetrical warfare. They are investing in ways that they can, at low cost, disrupt the American military organization. And the single biggest part of that, of course, is cyber attack. They have been trying to figure out what it would take to render those great advantages that the United States demonstrated in the Gulf War inoperable. How would you, there was a famous moment at which one of the generals who was directing the Gulf War said, "We own the night." And that is the first time any military force has ever been able to say that. Well, how do you stop the United States from owning the night? We own the night because of, again, of satellite, infrared, and information systems. So is there a way to demobilize those advantages, and then all of a sudden the United States is stuck in the broad daylight just like everybody else? How do you take the very connectivity that we rely on and make it a weakness? Right? The fact that we are entirely connected makes us vulnerable. How do you find low-cost ways to engage in this kind of disruption? That is what the Chinese have spent an enormous amount of time, energy, and investment doing. I think that it was the beginning of this new world that we are now entering. Now, I think it's fair to say that we are in the early stages of this world as well. We have seen some of the troubling signs about what this world now means. The most dramatic of which has, of course, been the whole WikiLeaks scandal, where you suddenly realize that people have access to everything and can do with it what they wish. Technologically, what happened in the WikiLeaks phenomenon is not that dramatic at all. It was basically just downloading off a computer. And so you begin to ask yourself, well, what are your defenses to all these things we're looking at when we consider them? And what are the defenses for business that isn't necessarily operating in a global environment? Well, the first thing you have to look at is common sense. Why was this guy, Bradley Manning, given access to this enormous amount of data, including classified cables from all over the world? Right? This was part of an understandable strategy during the Iraq War of saying, we want to get as much information as possible to the forward posts of the armed forces so that the people who are actually, risking their lives for our country don't have, don't want for information. Good idea, but do these guys really need to see readouts of the secret conversations between Hillary Clinton or, whoever, the Condoleezza Rice and various dissidents in various countries? Do they need to see the readouts on meetings between the French foreign minister and the American Secretary of State on, war planning? And I think that's a very important piece of this, which people sometimes forget. These are human rules that were put in place, and they were stupid rules. That was the fundamental reason WikiLeaks happened, not because of the fact that there was some technological glitch or that it was too easy to do something or not. It would have been very easy to encrypt this information in a way that Bradley Manning did not have access to it. We just didn't do it. It was a policy decision not to do it, and that was the mistake. And it has been this understandable desire to provide as much information and as many services as possible to frontline troops. But fundamentally, it's a bad idea. The Army is a hierarchical organization. It should stay hierarchical in terms of maintaining information restrictions and things like that. The second piece of this is a technological one, of course, which is how much can you do to block this information. You folks know this better than I do, but I would argue that more than anything else, what you have to do is just constant simulation of these attacks. You know, any Pentagon planner will tell you that the most important information they get is from the hordes of hackers whom they employ every day to try to break into their systems and to find the weak points and to find ways to then reinforce those weak points so that they are no longer weak. You can put in place all kinds of controls, but every control is a beta system. It has to be tested. It has to be tested constantly. And more than anything else, this is a kind of ongoing security measure, cost of doing business that becomes inevitable. The third level of this is government regulation. Should there be greater restrictions? Should ISP providers be required to identify signatures and then, you know, filter out the ones that seem questionable? They have the ability to do it. There's a question of whether or not it should be done. I myself would prefer to see some kind of voluntary system with rules, particularly relating to you know, utility companies, people that provide basic services like energy. I don't think it's as good an idea to have a very heavy national security overlay on this. But I have to say, knowing the American system, if we have one dramatic event, that will trigger exactly this kind of regulation. And so what we're better off doing is trying to think about what would be some kind of voluntary rules of the road that one could adopt that would make it less likely that you have a dramatic event. Because in the event of a dramatic cyber attack, Congress loses its sense. Washington basically goes crazy. I don't have to tell you this. I've always thought this was true about, you know, the potential for another Al-Qaeda attack. People will always say, well, what if they hit 3 shopping malls simultaneously? What would be the economic effect on the United States? And my answer was always, the economic effect on the United States would be negligible. You know, you're talking about a $14.5 trillion economy. 3 shopping malls, I mean, that's a rounding error on a rounding error on a rounding error, right? What you could be sure, however, is while it would have no impact on the actual economy of the United States, Washington would go nuts, right? And it would pass a whole series of laws, and we would now be down to strip searching before we got onto a plane, and you can imagine one thing after the other being caused by that. That's the great danger. And so you have to ask yourselves, what is it that we can do to make sure or to increase the odds that you do not have some kind of dramatic event? And I think better to adopt rules of the road now rather than to do it later. The final set of comments, though, I would make, and as I say, I'm happy to go deeper into the technology. My only fear is that you know more about it than I do, and I'm not going to be able to add that much value on it. Oh, I would say one thing about all this stuff. Don't panic. My own sense is, I hope I'm not offending anybody, I hope he's not in the audience, that if you read a book like Richard Clarke's book, Cyber War, it is a very, very useful set of things to think about. I think there is a tendency to create scare scenarios. You know, many of the events that, for example, are mentioned in that book as having been caused by cyber attacks, it's not actually clear that they were caused by cyber attacks. I mean, if your television catches fire tomorrow, the chances are it happened because a mouse ate the fiber optic cable that led to the television, not that the Chinese have somehow taken over your TV and are, you know, exploding it. There's a tendency to, you know, overinterpret this stuff, and you can't conjure up those scenarios because we are connected, and it is technically possible to do many of these things. But with, as I say, with a certain amount of technological safeguards, with common sense rules about who has access, with rules of the road about some signature identifications and such, you can deal with a lot of those things. And the most important thing for sensitive data has to be this constant use of your own cyber attack. your own internal group of hackers who are constantly trying to penetrate the system, so you figure out where your weak spots are and what you would do about them. But don't, you know, you can stop sleeping at night if you were to take these scare scenarios too seriously, and it would paralyze you, because at some level the system is so open. You know, you can't do anything other than shut down the whole damn system. And that's what I mean by the Iranian example, right? The Iranian government finally figured that all they could do was just shut down the whole cell phone system. That's not a very good risk-reward ratio in terms of how to think about this. The final set of comments I want to make, though, are about what would really trigger a problem that you would have to worry about. Well, the most important thing is if the underlying conditions I was describing were to change. You know, we're still living in a world in which you have economic convergence, you have political stability. The world of economic convergence does mean that companies are finding that they are competing against everybody in a pretty ruthless manner. And I don't have to tell you that corporations are finding that their secrets and their security systems are fair game in a way that they have never been before. But you ain't seen nothing yet. If you could imagine a world in which you had economic conflict and real political conflict between and among the great powers, you'd be in a very different world. You'd be in a world in which the state would be organizing and helping all of these efforts. Now, I realize it happens in some countries. You know, certainly in the case of China, there is some evidence that the Chinese government has been involved in even the corporate espionage business. But if we went down a path of greater economic nationalism, protectionism, and such, you would see that with every country in the world. You would see a much, much greater state involvement in these kind of technological issues. That would be a world which would be far more dangerous, and a world in which it would be far more difficult to protect ourselves. The broader and broadest issue, I would argue, is, of course, political conflict and political instability. If we ended up in a world in which you really had some kind of war or even great power rivalry on the scale of the Cold War, well, we'd be in a very different situation with all these things. You would have a breakdown of the rules of the road. You would have a breakdown of political cooperation. So that's the oxygen that has made it possible for us to have a reasonable equilibrium here. And the question is, how do we maintain that? Well, that's a broader question for any of us than what any of us can do. But what we could try to do is to take advantage of the circumstances as we have them and lock in a certain degree of cooperation and a certain degree of some rules of the road regarding the protocols governing the internet and such. This might sound fantastical, and people will say, well, why would you do this? Well, it's very simple, because fundamentally there's a lose-lose proposition in which everybody is spying on everybody else. Everybody is connected, but nobody is in control. That's the world we live in today. Everybody is connected and nobody is in control. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, how do we take advantage of the power of this incredible network and this communications technology and this information revolution? And we don't want to create, a world government or a cyber czar of the world, and we wouldn't be able to even if we wanted to. But how do we try to create some order that allows for this process to take place in an open, legal, transparent, predictable fashion? Are there small rules of the road we can put in place? Put your turn lights on when you want to turn. Things like that, not dramatic, but that would allow everyone to have a greater level of predictability. And what would those things look like? I think it's up to industry, in a sense, to try to begin to formulate what would these voluntary rules look like? What would you like to see the other guy agree to, and what would you be willing to agree to in return? We need a bottom-up process for this to happen. I think that you don't want this to be decided by three people in the White House. The Chief Technology Officer of the United States is a great guy, Anish Kapoor. And I remember the first time I was with him, and Somebody, he introduced himself to somebody, and it said CTO, United States of America. The guy who got it, he said, "You got to be kidding. You have got the best business card in the world." Because, of course, shall we say that the job description does not quite match the grandeur of the title, but that's true of many, many jobs in Washington. But I think what you really want is this to come as a micro process from bottom up. So I would suggest to you that you need to think a lot about what kind of world do you want to live in with this technology, and how would you go about creating some rules that would make that possible. I think that more than anything else, we all are trying to figure out how do you harness the incredible power of this new technology, how do you navigate this new world, and how do you make sure that you keep it secure. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Questions? Yeah. Comments? Disagreements? So. Yeah, it's a great question. By the way, the gentleman with the mic is not working, so you might want to do something about that. So now my mic is not working. I feel like it's got to be the Chinese. You see what I mean? It's easy to do this. So I'm going to repeat the question because it's a very important one. We talk about cyber attacks from China. We talk about the danger of cybersecurity from there. How does that fit in with the broader US-China relationship, the strategic relationship? This is second largest economy in the world, an economy we have to cooperate with, a country we are trying to maintain good and engaged relations with. I think it is going to be the central question we face going forward, and cybersecurity will be, in a way, at the tip of the spear of this issue, because you're absolutely right. Our fundamental goal must be to integrate China into the emerging world order, and we must recognize that they are going to do things that great powers do. We still have this tendency to regard with great horror Chinese decisions like their decision to start work on their first aircraft carrier group. Now, they're the second largest economy in the world. We've got 15. What do we think, that nobody will ever want any other than us? Or when we deal with the issues of where the Chinese Navy can go and things like that, we got to remember our Navy goes all over the world, right? And we regard that as an absolute right that the United States has. Or when we look at issues of spying, we are horrified when countries spy on us. But of course, we regard it as a very important stabilizing measure for global peace that we spy on them, right? So we're going to have a slightly more broad-minded understanding of this, not to say we don't protect our interests, not to say that we don't do the things we need to do, but that we don't behave like the captain in the movie Casablanca, who was shocked to discover there was gambling taking place at Rick's saloon. The point is, of course they're going to do some things that we don't like. We're doing them all the time, by the way. When I guess I didn't mention the cyber attacks we're launching on Chinese defense computers. But that's precisely where you need some rules of the road. You need some understanding that this is permissible, this is not. If one side oversteps the bounds on this issue, this would be the normal tit for tat that would take place. You know, again, during the Cold War, we had those kind of arrangements with the Soviet Union, even with regard to spies. There was a kind of gentleman's agreement about what would happen if one of your spies was caught and how they would be exchanged. There were rules of the road about what was considered okay, what was not, what was in the gray zone that had to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. That's what we need. And I do agree with you that there needs to be a slightly greater understanding that as China is going to rise to great economic and political power, it is going to do some of the things that we do. And that American exceptionalism cannot carry so far as to believe that we have the right to spy on everybody else and they don't have the right to spy on us. And in any event, even if we believe that, it ain't going to happen. You know, the Chinese are not going to stop doing it because we think it's weird. They're going to do what they're going to do, and we're going to have to make our peace with it. So I think it's very important to remember as these countries are coming up that they are not doing things that are evil, nasty, necessarily evil, nasty, and aggressive. They're doing the things we're doing. And that part of living in this world is recognizing that each country has its own interests, and they will try to secure them. And if we want to see them do a little bit less of what we don't like, we probably are going to have to do a little bit less of what we're doing as well. That this is going to have to be a kind of mutual system here. For the last 20 years, since the Cold War ended, we got used to a very lopsided trade on these kinds of issues in global affairs, where, you know, everybody else had to do something, but the rules didn't apply to us. You know, the International Criminal Court was a great idea that we wanted every other country to sign up. Well, of course, we weren't going to sign up because we were the United States. You know, those rules don't apply to us. So that kind of asymmetry won't work anymore.
I recall two conversations that occurred 15 years ago. One of them was, I'm Alan Merton from George Mason University. One conversation with the CEO of a large bank, and I asked him, was he worried about cyber attacks on his system? He said, yes, but I'm really worried about my competitor spreading the word that I had a cyber attack on my system, or my customers finding out that I had a cyber attack. So he wasn't worried about the event, he was worried about the publicity associated with the event. The other my question in both of these is if things changed. I was talking to a student who had a job offer to go to work with a firm on the area of information system security, and he said, no, I'd rather go to work for companies where I'm involved with the capacity of the system to do good things, as opposed to working on things for a company that I'd be the person responsible for keeping bad things from happening. Has the world changed?
You know, I do think the world has changed in both there. It's a very, very interesting picture of what the world looked like 15 years ago. I would say that I bet you that CEO would today say that he was worried about the attack itself, because the scope of what you can do 15 years ago was actually relatively minor. It was a kind of minor harassment. Today you could destroy the entire bank, but partly because these banks now live in this world of so much connectivity and such complex systems and such complex information flows. I mean, imagine a Lehman Brothers with, what was it, something like $700–800 billion of derivatives on its books. Well, that's all computer information. You could make that 900 billion. You could make it 1.2 trillion. If you wanted to very skillfully take down a bank, the way you do it today wouldn't be to freeze their accounts or something as silly as that. What you would do is you would increase their bad loans. You'd basically take each one of them and give them a Greece or a Lehman Brothers on their books. And all of a sudden, they have to raise more capital, and they're trying to figure out, there's many more sophisticated ways now to cause serious trouble. And I would say that your young man today would I think also find the challenge much more intellectually stimulating, because this is very hard stuff, figuring out how to block it and what you should do about it and what measures you should take against it. I would also point out that with 9% unemployment, I think he'll take any job he could get.
Fareed, we have time for one more question back here.
I understand this is working now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Terry Jensen, SAIC, and I just got back from 2 years at U.S. European Command in
Can you speak a bit louder?
I just got back from the U.S. European Command in Stuttgart, Germany, where I was working with various countries and also NATO. And I think you're right on your talk here. First of all, it is a question of international cooperation. If you look back at what the White House did last year, they wrote a document called the International Strategy for Cyberspace. And if you go to the website of the White House and you can download this document, it's an excellent document that outlines how the international community should cooperate in cyber. However, at the time it came out, being in Europe, I noticed an awful lot of a cold shoulder, more or less, to the policy. And I think the reason was that there is a reluctance, especially since the U.S. is the one who invented the internet, to have the U.S. be the cyber superiority power of the internet. And so even our friends over there, countries that were very friendly with us, our allies, are against a lot of that policy that's been published by the White House. And if we can get to the point where NATO and the United Nations and the other groups can achieve what you talk about in this policy cooperation, the small rules, I think you're right on that is where the answer is going to be to having global stability and global security.
I think that's a very, very interesting point. You know, it's partly a picture of the new world we've moved into, where it's a phenomenon I call the rise of the rest, just all these other countries that have risen in power and prominence and affluence, but also the growing assertiveness of countries in Europe, none of which like the idea of the US being the kind of dominant power, hegemon, dictating to them, and as a result, even a good set of ideas, even a good agenda that is put out by the US is looked at with a certain degree of suspicion. This happens for different sets of reasons. I mean, in the case of China, for example, the Chinese always look at anything the United States proposes on these kinds of issues very skeptically because they assume that the US government will always have some kind of secret backdoor into these kind of technologies. One of the reasons that no Chinese government computer ever uses Microsoft, because they're convinced that Microsoft being an American company, there must be a CIA backdoor into Windows. Because of course, if Microsoft were a Chinese company, there would surely be a government backdoor. And so they mirror image. I think in Europe it is precisely the kind of sense of the United States is too dominant in this realm, and the last thing we want is to kind of reinforce that dominance, and the Europeans still, I mean the French government is still pouring billions of dollars into trying to fund an alternative to Google. You know, so there's still a great desire to see a greater degree of equality there. It's always why I have believed, and I wish the Bush administration had believed this more because we had more political capital then, that it's much easier to work through international institutions in the long run because you mask your power. It is, in the short run, much more cumbersome and crazy and a headache, and you know the UN is dysfunctional, and I know that whole piece very well. You know, I live in New York, close to the UN, but the reality is that it masks the ability, you know, the reality of American power, and it allows these ideas and agendas to be brought up by other countries, by other organizations, and we're going to have to get much better at that than we are right now. You know, even something like the statement of White House cybersecurity, which I agree with you, is very, very good. I just wonder, you know, would it have made more sense for us to not publish a paper like that and to have, you know, handed it to a friendly country like Singapore or somebody and said, hey, do you guys want to propose some of these ideas at the UN? Let's, you know, and then have them propose it, and then we can embrace it and reinforce it, and then we have a White House paper saying we welcome with great encouragement what, you know, Singapore is doing on these issues, and we support it. We don't think like that yet. We tend to think entirely about leadership in terms of we take the lead, which is understandable. That's how we've done business since 1945. But I do think we need a different model for this, particularly with the area that is as sensitive as you described, and you're very right. But it raises this broader issue of are we equipped to lead in this new world where, you know, countries from China to India to Brazil to Turkey are all feeling like you know what? They want they want a seat at the table. They want their voices to be heard. They want to be, you know, not forever taking dictation when the United States stands up, but participating fully. And as they become economically stronger, politically more stable, culturally more confident, these conditions are only going to expand. It's, you know, it's really welcome to the new world, not just technologically, but politically and diplomatically and culturally. And that's the biggest adjustment for the United States, I think. How to live in a world in which you need to stay very engaged, but you don't dominate. Our two modes have been we either withdraw from the world because we think it's evil, or we dominate the world. We haven't yet found the Goldilocks formula. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fareed, for such an interesting presentation. We're honored to have you here with us. We're going to have the last break of the morning, so we will come back promptly at 11:15. Enjoy the last break. Thank you again.